Okay, now, before I begin with William Howard Taft, I need to finish up with Teddy Roosevelt and his infamous dinner, or famous dinner, with Booker T. Washington. Now, shortly after he assumed office on September 14, 1901, Roosevelt extended a dinner invitation to Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House. Now, you need to realize when a president, any president, invites any person to dinner with the first family, it's not the usual, hey, how you doing? How's the family? What have you been up to lately? How's the job going? No, even though it's an informal gathering, it is still about the business of the country. Now, according to the National Park Service website, Roosevelt had known Washington for a number of years before the famous dinner. They had formed a political relationship probably around 1898 when Washington agreed to support Roosevelt's future bid for the presidency. Roosevelt was very fond of Washington personally and approved of his overall approach towards racial matters. Booker T. Washington was one of the dominant figures in the African American struggle for racial equality. Now, Washington was on a speaking tour in the South when President Roosevelt sent a telegram asking him to come to the Capitol for a conference in D.C. Now, Washington agreed to the meeting. When he arrived in Washington, D.C. on October 16th, President Roosevelt sent an invitation to dine at the White House at 8 o'clock that evening. Now, nothing like that had ever been done before, and he was going to dine with Roosevelt's family. Now, present at this dinner were the president, obviously, his wife Edith, his oldest daughter Alice, and 3 of his 4 sons, as well as Philip Stewart, a friend and hunting companion of the president. Now, there is no official record of what was discussed during the dinner. Speculation abounds, but I'm sure the conversation at some point centered on the issue of race and equality. You see, Roosevelt respected Washington's views and political acumen on race relations and political appointments for federal jobs in the South. Now, one question I have about this historic event is, what did they have for dinner? Well, an excerpt from Deborah Davis's book, Guest of Honor, Booker T. Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and the White House Dinner That Shocked a Nation, and it did shock the nation. This was published in the Huffington Post. It suggests probably mock turtle soup, boiled filet of veal, potatoes a la Delmonico, fried eggplants, and mashed squash, along with olives, saucer pudding, and apple snow crisp cookies. It sounds delicious, even though I don't know half those dishes. Now, in less than 24 hours, though, the news of that dinner was nationwide. The political fallout lasted for weeks in newspapers across the country. Now, the articles are too inflammatory for me to repeat in a public forum such as this. I will post a link in the description for those who care to read them. However, I will say that a number of the articles were most likely written by men who ran around at night hiding their faces under white pointy-headed sheets and would burn crosses in the front of people's homes. Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan was a God-fearing organization that hated blacks, Catholics, Jews, Asians, Arabs, and anybody who was not white and Protestant and from the Deep South. Yeah, talk about oxymorons. I refer to this group as the Pointy-Headed Moron Squad. Well, anyways, Roosevelt was surprised and also furious at the backlash, especially from the Southern white leaders who championed Washington as the leader of his race. Now, in his book, T.R. The Last Romantic, H.W. Brand quotes Roosevelt's private reaction to the dinner's uproar. The idiot or vicious bourbon element of the South is crazy because I have had Booker T. Washington to dine. I shall have him to dine as often as I please. Now, an interesting side note before I move on to President Taft. Roosevelt's close friend, British diplomat Cecil Spring Rice, wrote this about T.R. You must remember that the president is about 6. People saw a naivete in Roosevelt that they thought was childlike, but I believe it was something else. Roosevelt's zest for life and adventure, his belief in right from wrong with very little room for gray areas, his determination to get things done, his demonstrative personality, and his ability to command the center stage in whatever he undertook gave Roosevelt an inner core that made him a straight shooter, which could come across as the innocence of a 6-year-old child. You know, why, this isn't right, how come? Now, it was his certainty of right from wrong and his larger-than-life personality that would make the job of Roosevelt's successor very difficult, if not impossible, to measure up to the Roosevelt standard. Now, Roosevelt is considered one of the top 5 presidents of the United States. I would say he's number 3 after George Washington and Abe Lincoln. His character and personal code of honor is what made TR a great progressive president. Okay, now we're going to turn to William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States. He was Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked successor to the presidency for the 1908 election. Now, Roosevelt could have run for president in 1908, but for the promise he made at his 1904 inauguration that he would not run for another term of office. Now, unfortunately for Taft, he just wasn't as dynamic or charismatic as Roosevelt. In modern terms of public relations, Taft was not good copy. He was brilliant, he was hardworking, he actually did more than Roosevelt in the trust busting. The problem was his image. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 355 pounds at the time of his inauguration, and he didn't really like the public spotlight, whereas Roosevelt craved it. His oldest daughter Alice once remarked, "My father always wants to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening." Taft did not stand a chance of emerging from Roosevelt's shadow. The press had a field day with Taft's weight issues. Jokes about how Taft was being cruel to the horse when he went riding were commonplace. One joke made by Justice Brewer of the Supreme Court said that Taft is the politest man in Washington. The other day, he gave up his seat in the streetcar to 3 ladies. Yeah, that's pretty cruel. Now, Taft had a custom-made tub installed in the White House for his personal use. Unfortunately, the 4 workmen who were installing the tub had their photographs taken while all 4 of them were in the tub at the same time. Now, this was probably the reason for the rumors that Taft became stuck in the White House bathtub. It never happened, though. I have posted the link below to that story. It's actually pretty interesting reading. Now, President Taft's progressive accomplishments were overshadowed by his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt. However, Taft's progressive agenda during his 4-year administration could be considered successful if it wasn't for his mundane and inoffensive character. He just wasn't as newsworthy as Theodore Roosevelt. The 2 major progressive reforms that he failed to enact in the beginning of his administration, the tariff reduction and conservation legislation, caused the press to savage his administration. Now, interestingly enough, in all other areas of domestic policy, he did just as much, if not more, than Theodore Roosevelt. Taft brought twice the number of antitrust cases to the court than Roosevelt. He went after and won a case against Standard Oil of New Jersey, the American Tobacco Company, the Sugar Trust, and U.S. Steel. Now, those were the heavy hitters of major corporations in America at that time. However, Roosevelt became critical of Taft because he could not tell the difference between a good trust and a bad one, and he let the country know of his disappointment in the papers. Now, in the last years of his first and only term, 1911, Taft backed off of going after the trust. He had been persuaded by his pro-business advisors and friends that the antitrust crusade was hurting the economy. Now, today, we would call this the presidential bubble or the echo chamber. Taft had become reliant on his friends and advisors who he trusted, but they had their own agendas to push and were able to convince President Taft that their policies were good for the country, contrary to what was actually happening in the country. Okay, besides trust busting, Taft signed the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 into law. Now, this act gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the authority to suspend railroad rate hikes and to set rates. The act also gave the ICC jurisdiction over telephone, telegraphs, and radios. He placed postmasters under the umbrella of the Federal Civil Service Protection, which meant that they could no longer be fired just because administrations changed. Where Taft went afoul, though, of the progressives was the Payne-Aldrich tariff and the conservation movement. Okay, a quick review on what a tariff is. Now let's say I'm the head guy of an American car making company. My company is losing money because foreign car companies are shipping their cars to America and Americans are buying them. This is cut into my company's profits. Well, that's not good. I run a very large corporation which affects the nation's economy. So I go to my political friends, you know, senators, representatives, maybe even the president, and tell them that I need them to put a very large tax on the foreign companies that want to sell cars in America. Okay, how large are you asking for? Well, that depends. It has to be enough to put the purchase price of the foreign cars higher than the purchase price of my company cars. Now, tariffs are used to protect American business from unfair competition and raise revenues for the national government. Tariffs are also used as a foreign policy tool to get other countries to do what the United States wants. Now, that's a very simplistic example of tariffs. I realize, but to go any deeper would go beyond the scope of this video. Just remember, a tariff is a tax levied on foreign goods coming into the country in order to protect American goods and also to raise government revenues. Okay, so back to Taft and the famous Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. Taft wanted a major tariff reduction. This caused the protectionist wing of the Republican Party, who were a majority, to become apoplectic. Okay, that's a big word for becoming very angry and upset. This in turn caused Taft to reconsider tariff reduction. He was able to save face when Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island and Representative E. Payne of New York, representing big business, succeeded in pushing through their tariff bill, which also included a small income tax on American corporations. Now, it was only a small reduction, but as Taft said, it was the best tariff bill ever passed by Congress. I mean, what else could he say? Sorry, my guys couldn't go for it, so this is the best I can do. Yeah, not very presidential. Now, the second thing that got the progressives upset was to appoint Richard A. Bollinger, U.S. Secretary of the Interior. He fired Roosevelt's guy, which he said he would not do during the campaign. Now, Bollinger came out and said President Roosevelt did not have the authority to take certain lands out of the public domain and preserve them. One of Bollinger's first acts was to restore 3 million acres of land back into private use, basically leasing public lands for private development for lumber, minerals, hydroelectric projects. Now, the conservationists and the progressives were not amused. Then there was the accusation of favoritism by Bollinger in issuing leases. The break with the progressive wing of the Republican Party happened in what was called the Pinchot-Bollinger controversy. In short, Gifford Pinchot openly criticized President Taft and asked for congressional hearings into the ethics of Bollinger's dealings. And Pinchot was promptly fired by Taft, insubordination most likely. Now, here's a thought. If you ever find yourself in conflict with your boss, don't openly defy him or her. That is the quickest way to the unemployment line. Now, if you ever find yourself as president, there are a few lessons you might want to remember. The first lesson is, don't make an enemy out of the person who is more popular than you. Taft fired one of Teddy Roosevelt's closest friends. Roosevelt felt Taft had betrayed him and the progressive movement, so TR challenged Taft for the Republican nomination in the 1912 election, which split the Republican vote and threw the election to President Woodrow Wilson. More about him in the next video. Now, the second thing, don't let your advisors control you. And finally, don't ever agree to let anybody named a stuffed animal after you. You see, President-elect Taft agreed to the marketing of Possum Billy. His team was trying to compete with the stuffed teddy bear. It's a true story. I put the link in the description below. You won't believe what they had for dinner that night. Now, I know I say this all the time, but it does work. Go to class, pay attention, and take notes. Then study your notes every night for about 5 minutes, 10 at the most. You won't need to cram the night before your test. Remember, 90% of success is just showing up. The other 10% is applying yourself. Okay, now I hope you liked this video. Now if you did, hit the like button, ring the bell, and subscribe to my channel. Also, it would be great if you could leave a comment below. Hey, thank you for watching.